Hopefully my camera will stay on its mount and not collapse and not short out.
I did
Mark,
I did like the Batman cave, evil villain cave angle you had your camera before the show started on. I kind of like that. So,
well, also I'd like to note that thanks to a suggestion that you made a few weeks ago, and I was having all the technical difficulties, my wife and I did a project last weekend where we actually ran Ethernet cable down to the studio. So I am I'm going through a portal, like a hub, because of the the new computers just have USB-C. But yeah, it's been pretty great. So let's see. Oh, here we go. Here comes Jeff.
Wired is the way to go.
Yes.
I mean, Wi-Fi is nice, but wired, especially when you're doing streaming and stuff, that's what you should do, really.
Yeah, I've noticed a big difference. And speaking of different, wait, that was a terrible transition. Hey, Jeff.
It was a segue.
Google Chrome is always a little tricky. Sorry about that. My apologies.
No worries.
How are you guys? Good to see you.
Great. We haven't really started. We're just kind of getting on. We're a couple minutes late.
Sure.
But so we are here to talk about a movie. I think I'm going to pronounce the name right. M3GAN. Is that right? Do I have it right?
It's a little shticky, isn't it? But I think you can just say Megan.
It's Megan.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
You could get away with saying Megan. It's just spelt in leet. So there you go.
Nice.
I just don't some names are tricky. But so this movie came out just about a week ago, and so I've assembled some of Earth's Mightiest Critics to talk about it. I'm excited to talk about this movie because I was really jazzed and kind of hyped up on this thing. But the further away I get, as I still like it, but it's a matter of liking over loving. And I want to talk about the movie itself. It's pretty solid box office this weekend, and what we might think of its kind of staying power, not just in terms of like, is it going to beat out Avatar 2 at some point, but just like, do we think this is a cult classic in the making, or is it just kind of like, it was good, and then there'll be another Blumhouse movie next year that we'll talk about, or probably 3 this year because they're a factory now. But joining me, I'm Ian Simmons of Kicking the Seat, of course. We have Mark the Movie Man Krawczyk of the Spoiler Room and Special Mark Productions, and we have Jeff York of the Establishing Shot. Thank you all for joining me, gentlemen. How you doing?
Very good, thank you. Great to be here.
All right, Mark. How are you doing?
Yeah, you let anyone in this, I guess.
You be nice to Jeff. No, I'm kidding.
I'm not talking about Jeff. I'm in excellent company. So
everyone's taking a sip. I got to join the club.
I'm more like the Gleek. I'm like the Gleek of the Earth's Mightiest Critics.
But... Oh, get out of here!
That's not true. Not true.
Besides, no DC talk on this channel.
It's one of those channels. All right. Well,
all right. So, Jeff, let's start with you because I don't know if you posted this on Facebook or somewhere, but you got pretty excited during the critics screening of this movie. I understand there was some laughter, which, like, right off the bat, I wasn't expecting this to be a horror comedy kind of satirical movie. I thought it was going to be a straight up horror film, but it's quite funny. So were you surprised by that too?
I was. In fact, one of the problems that you always have when you go into a January movie, in one that's earmarked for being released that year, not like an Oscar contender that gets rolled out after the holidays in January or February, as is often the case. It's never a good sign. Usually it's like it's a dumping ground, and even like horror as a counter to the sugar and saccharine of the holiday season is oftentimes less than stellar. So, but this one had a screening. I thought, well, generally when we have screenings for them, they tend to be more of note, or at least the studio is high on them. So I went in this one a little bit apprehensive, but also a little bit encouraged the fact that they were even having a screening. And I have to tell you, maybe because I've seen so many horror movies where I'm disappointed right away, and then it just kind of continues to go down and down and down. This one started off with a very funny satire of toy commercials, and I used to be a creative director, and as we've talked about, and I worked on toy commercials, and they have it dead to nuts. It's right, and it's funny, and it's just the same tone and the camera angles. It's like, wow, these guys did their homework. They really studied toy commercials to understand how they're acted, how they're edited together. And, you know, it's such a weird premise. Like, pets are great, but pets die. That's why you need a fake pet. And I just thought, oh my God. And then, of course, you can see, you know, you get a little bit ahead of it, that it's going to set up her fake friend and all that kind of stuff. But I have to say, the fact that this was not me laughing at it because it was cheesy, but laughing at it because I think they went out of their way to make it witty, to have this protagonist doll, or antagonist doll, I guess, as it were, be very smart and very sly. It reminded me of a lot of other movies like Terminator and Westworld. And there was, you know, clearly homages to that. And I just was sort of tickled by the fact that I was waiting for this to kind of fall apart and fall apart and fall apart, and it never did. Now, to your earlier question, Ian, I don't know if it's going to be one of those that, you know, come year end next year, I'll put on my top 10 list or not. And who knows, you know, I think time makes movies either less great or suddenly cult classics, or better than we thought they were. But for a January movie, I mean, this one I thought was really good and really kind of had me laughing from beginning to end. And I'm just going to say one quick thing too, but maybe it's more for later. I can't remember the last time there was a villain, if you will, in a movie where I kind of agreed with the villain most of the time. And I say that here because it's like, you know, the character that Allison Williams plays, Gemma, the scientist, she's very selfish. She makes a lot of dumb, bad choices throughout. And I kept thinking, you know, this little doll really is doing what she's been asked to do. And she's very thorough in it. And, you know, she's kind of not taking any crap and kind of eye on the prize stuff. So I was finding her kind of admirable, even, you know, because she's not like a savage, crazy loon. No, right. This is her program. And, you know, that little boy at the fairground, at the campgrounds is a badass. Let's take care of him. Get him out of the way. You know, so I found that kind of refreshing too, because, you know, you said you kind of start almost, I don't want to say cheering for the villain, but there's worse villains on display. And in many respects, Megan's purity, I think, makes her a little bit noble.
Yeah, and I do want to come back to that, what you mentioned with
Sure.
Allison Williams' character later, because I think that is something that I picked up on in terms of the kind of messaging that we don't really see a lot in mainstream entertainment or pop culture. But before you get to that, Mark, what you teased this out on your live stream the other night that you might have sort of a differing opinion on Megan. So let's hear it.
No, in my review, I still gave it a fairly glowing positive review. On the whole, I was surprised. I mean, I'm a horror fan, and in the last 5 years, it's been wonderful to see how the mainstream movie audience has embraced horror. Because horror, after the golden age of the 80s, even into the 90s when Scream came around, it kind of tapered off, especially when you got into 2000s. And sure, you could relate some real world stuff to that. So much horror, it turned people off. Now it's weird. Since the pandemic, horror has exploded for a number of reasons, I think. I've seen this film before with Megan. That's not a criticism. It's just a simple fact. If you watch enough horror, especially, we've mentioned it before, AI gone rogue is territory we've ventured in before.
Right.
I will agree with Jeff in that they did homework and they did it with care to where, yeah, it starts off a little satirical, but there's some meat and some things that they do a bit differently with it, that it starts out really strong. In the middle, it sort of teeters for me. And at the end, I was a bit disappointed because it fell back on we've seen this many times before tropes.
Right.
So to start out so strong and interesting, like you said, the Gemma character, we don't just have the kid warming up to her. They explore grief with kids. They bring up this idea of imprinting. So they explain it in such a way to it explains why this young girl is attached to the robot. I mean, they have set all these things up so much. And then, like I said, they start to get a little bit in the weeds, but by the end of it, I was like, oh, now you ended it exactly like every other horror film. And again, not saying it's necessarily bad, because I like those type of endings, but at the same time, where you start out and where it ended was was a little bit anticlimactic for me in a way. But overall, I liked the character setup. I wish I hadn't watched the trailers, because if you're talking action sequences, they literally put every main action piece, some scene or the main creepy part in the trailer, unfortunately. So those weren't surprises at all. And it kind of lost tension. Where this film, I think, is far more effective are the quiet moments. And I mentioned this too in my room. The parts that creep me out the most are where Megan is sitting with Gemma and the young girl, I forgot her name.
Katie. Yeah.
Where they're just sitting at the other and they're conversing, and Megan is like, you know, she's already tuned into the internet and she's throwing words back at Gemma, or she's in a conversation, or she's in the observation thing, you know, with young Katie, and she's putting on the show. Those are the moments that I think are most effective in this film. It's not so much the horror part, which, by the way, this thing really wanted to be R. It really so much really kind of wanted to be R with what they were touching on. But for me, it was most effective when you just had those quiet moments, because that's just like the "What are you doing, Dave?" Hal moments.
Very much so.
In there, you know.
Let's talk about that rating. Because, and we're in spoiler territory, because we're going to kind of jump around here, because stream of consciousness, and I'm very tired. There are two, okay, so Gemma works as, she's like a robotics engineer at this toy company, and she's kind of struggling because she's been tasked to work on the next gen version of this kind of Furby-esque AI, you know, doll, which what is great, because it kind of looks like a Furby, but it has the teeth of, I should have pulled this up, but there's like a deep sea creature that looks like a starfish almost, that it looks like has human teeth. And I don't know if you've seen this, like with the gums and everything. That's what this Furby thing looked like. It's totally creepy and weird, but it's apparently a hot seller. But she really wants to be working on this this Megan, this kind of AI, you know, American doll toy. And she gets her chance sort of by accident and by tragedy, a corporate accident, and also by the fact that her sister and her sister's husband die in a car accident, leaving little Katie as an orphan, which is the opening scene of the film, which also reminded me of, I think it was the opening of Shazam. Like you could almost play these things together, because I think the main villain of that movie we see as a child who, you know, gets roughed up in a car accident. But Gemma has two lab assistants that at the end, in the, you know, one of the climaxes of this movie, or I guess the pre-climax, they're in the lab with Gemma and they're trying to shut her down. And this is sort of the suspenseful thing of like removing the cables, and the one guy is like way too close, and of course Megan gets out and starts attacking them, and she blows up the lab. And I was thinking back on it, the scene is shot just in such a way that when they pop up at the end, they're like, oh, that's right, they were kind of weirdly underneath the fire special effects, so I guess maybe they survived. But I have a feeling if this was a bit of a, like an R-rated, maybe a darker, edgier movie, they would have just gotten blown up. I did not, as much as I thought these characters were fun, I did not want to see them pop up at the end. It's like that thing where I think Austin Powers did this with Will Ferrell's henchman character. He falls down the canyon. He's like, I'm
burned very badly, but I'm all right. Yeah,
right.
Still
it's
alive.
That, yeah, and the trope has been repeated in pop culture for 25 years. It's just so obnoxious.
Right.
So to see it again, like, you got to be better than that, Megan. But yeah, I think, and some of the, like when the boss guy, again, we're in spoiler territory, so if you haven't seen Megan, what are you doing here? He gets impaled with a sword. Right. You've had a week, but he gets impaled with a sword, like coming through an elevator, and it's all like underneath his shirt. I mean, you can see the impact of it, but I'm like, that should have been a chest bursting scene.
Well, you know, you wonder, to that very question, Ian, if some of this was either adjusted or fixed in post, as they say, because my guess is it probably could have been a lot more violent, and maybe was, and you know, maybe they had some of that carnage that horror audiences often want, the bloodletting that, you know, you kind of have to do for the bloodlust of various people who want to see that in these kind of movies, especially when, you know, a creature or a doll or whatever it is, the villain is going on a rampage. But I wonder if they looked at it and somebody said, you know, this M3GAN doll is pretty cute and she's fun and she's likable. And God damn it, she's actually the most moral person on screen here. And she's making the right choices. And I don't think she'd kill two people who really aren't a threat to her. Or I don't want the audience to get tied up with these deaths that are going to be, you know, sticking in their craw or, you know, seem too much, which I think was a little bit of an issue, just to borrow from another movie. One of the issues I had with The Menu, which I liked a lot, but then to me, the whole ending is like, did all those people deserve to die? I don't know. I'm not sure if some of them should have fought back or not been invited. Going to Brown, I don't think is a crime, even if you got some money from your parents. But nonetheless, here, I think they may have decided to tone it down a bit, pull back the R, pull back the violence, maybe save a couple of characters, because they thought, you know, we have for the first time in a really, really long time, a kind of, dare I say, likable villain that, you know, you're not really rooting for her to die at the end. In fact, to be perfectly blunt, and I'll just go here because we are talking spoilers. I thought if this really wanted to be like the 70s, like Westworld, where, you know, it's got a little bit more of that edge and those quiet moments. And I agree with you, those moments, Mark, where where M3GAN was just looking and her gaze would just drift like that. It was so Yul Brynner, like, get the little boy his mommy. He needs a glass of milk. And then he just slowly looks over at Richard Benjamin at the bar, you know. That kind of shit was so frightening. And like, that doll is thinking. It's just like the red light that Kubrick shoots closer and closer. And we like, that brain is on, and we're getting closer into what he's thinking. And we know what he's thinking. I got to get rid of these astronauts. So I think they may have changed a little bit because I think they realized that M3GAN is so kind of, dare I say, lovable.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the appeal to the wider audience. I want to preface this by saying I am not by any means putting down or trying to put in a negative light or even think negatively of wide release mainstream horror viewing audience. Okay. Sure. I watch a lot of stuff. I watch an extreme amount of stuff that very few people are like, why on earth would you watch that? Okay. That's just me. I'll watch anything once. So, but looking at it from someone who may just consume horror from the big screen, from the theaters, or maybe from your main streaming services, and you're not digging around on Tubi, right? You know, I could see the big appeal for this M3GAN. It's the same appeal back in the late 80s, early 90s of Chucky. It's the same appeal. You know, I'm not putting her up there yet with the other horror icons, but I will say I agree with you, Jeff. As far as modern horror goes, this is one of the first characters in a long time who wasn't from a previous IP who feels legit in that spirit, in that style, even more so than the clown from Terrifier. No offense to the clown in Terrifier, but he's more of a Michael Myers than it. And no, Michael Myers out of all the horror icons has the least personality. He's got personality, but she is charismatic. You're right. She makes some of the good points, and she is likable. Regardless of your marketing, they've established a creepy character that you can root for, which is the spirit of those horror icons that still have some movies coming out today. I will say that I will not say this would probably be a cult classic. The only reason I say it's a cult classic is because it's popular now. Yeah. The thing with cult classics, or things that are cult classics, are films that weren't really popular, failed at the box office. Yeah. Not a lot of people talked about, but then over the years, word of mouth and fans pulled other people, and they're like, holy crap, this is amazing. You know, why didn't
they may have been ahead of their time, and then people catch up to it. Like The Thing, I think we've talked about that. Like, that was vilified when it came out, and now it's regarded as one of the top 10 best horror movies of all time. And poor John Carpenter almost lost his career because that movie bombed. And I don't know if he ever really recovered from that. And, you know, if he waited 30 years, he might have been in a better place, but it's too bad.
Then there's the queen. Then there's the queen of all B cult movies is Rocky Horror Picture Show. Look at that film, you know, what following and it has today versus when it first came out. So as far as cult classic, I wouldn't put M3GAN as far as a future or whatever cult classic because it's appealing. I would put M3GAN in as as close as we've gotten to the golden age of 80s horror slasher characters, she is a modern version of that, bar none. You have all those elements, you know,
with, I think, a pretty distinct difference. And this is one of the things that I think is so appealing to me about this movie and why it's a Blumhouse production. I don't want to see a sequel. I don't want to see Megan ever again. And that's not a knock on her character, because I think it's weird that we're talking about her like, oh, she's likable and she's a character, because she is just an AI toy. I think that's one of the kind of the psychic, you know, big jokes about this movie is she's not really a character. She is a learning toy, but we ascribe to her because she's like this cute little blonde, you know, girl who can mimic the affects of an actual kid. We kind of ascribe a personality to her. But what I thought, one thing that sets this apart from just being another Child's Play, because when I first heard about it, I was like, oh, it's another, you know, possessed killer doll. Or even, and I want to pull over for a second to bring up this David Wilt's comment here. Megan looks like something out of the Twilight Zone episode Living Doll, which Jeff, I know you referenced early on.
Talkie Tina.
Right. My name is Talkie Tina. Oh, that was some great Telly Savalas.
Oh
too.
My God, what a brilliant episode.
Oh,
nice going, David. Thank you for bringing that comment up. That was great.
But the difference is, like, Talkie Tina, Chucky, a bunch of the other, you know, you think of the voodoo doll from
Trilogy of Terror.
Trilogy of Terror, right?
Yep.
These are all
or the less celebrated Ooga Booga from Full Moon Pictures. Anyway,
yes.
There you go. But
that's now you know where my wheelhouse sits.
Oh, I love it. I love hanging out with you guys. It's like you bring up movies I haven't thought of in I don't know how long, but that's great.
But the key difference is that those cases are possessed, otherworldly things that have manifested or taken over dolls. Megan is just artificial intelligence. There's never a point where, oh, someone wrote an evil program or there was a lightning bolt that put Satan in this plastic body.
Right.
And what I think is fascinating is the kind of hypothesis is if you build an AI and it's, you know, tapped into the internet and trained to, you know, watch people's behaviors and kind of grow with what it learns, you know, it's learning with a modern, you know, preteen girl and a parental figure who would much rather just put this kid in front of a screen. And so it becomes manipulative and, you know, I guess, quote unquote, evil, but it's all sort of situational. It's all very logical. And Jeff, to something you alluded to earlier, which we'll talk about in a bit, it kind of calls out the main characters saying like, well, you know, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with you? You know,
to your point,
I would not be necessary if you and, you know, other young parents or whatever were doing your jobs.
Right, exactly. And it's fun you say that, Ian, too, because I think you're right. Megan is really only as good as she's been programmed to be, which is kind of what is Hal 2000, as well as the gunslinger character or the rest of the robots in the original Michael Crichton film, Westworld, in '73. And that is, they've been programmed enough to know what works and what doesn't. And if they have any primal thing that's been baked into their system that maybe is a little humanistic, and that is that they want to survive. So the gunslinger learns to somehow really shoot, you know, and Hal learns to read lips and do what he can to not be shut down and keep those from achieving his main directive. That's what I think makes Megan kind of likable, is she actually is programmed to be a caretaker, a sort of guard, a playmate, and a teacher. And most of the stuff that she does is within that world. And really, the people that she kills, while those two doofuses who maybe tried to sort of shut her down, they're not really awful people sort of out to get that little girl in a way. They're really there just out to stop Megan, which is different. So she maybe doesn't kill them. The people she does kill are threatening Katie. And what I loved about this movie, and I don't want to segue into it yet because we don't have to, we've got time on it, but I love the fact that it really becomes sort of a story about mothering, like who's actually the better caretaker. And time and time again, as I was watching it, they go out of their way. And this is the cleverness or the insidiousness of the writing. I don't know which, maybe both, but Gemma's shit. She is a terrible parent over and over again.
Yeah.
And then at the end, she's a terrible employee that, she's got the whole world waiting to see her introduce this AI doll. And she's like, fuck it. I'm going to stay home. I'm going to get on the internet right now and take this fancy old, automobile home and just sit in my car. What? I mean, and yet Megan is like, hey, you told me to watch out for her. I'm watching out for her. Oh, you're off talking with the mom at the campgrounds. Meanwhile, Junior over here is getting her into I don't know. Is he going to rape her? I don't think so. But it's funny how they go there. He's got her spread eagle on, then he's mounting her. And then Megan's like, hell with that. This is where I come in, move over Teddy Ruxpin, and I love the fact that there's Megan. It's like, she's not trying to say like, hey, I'm a better mom or I'm smarter, but she is a better mom and she is smarter and she's the only one paying attention. How many times is Gemma not paying attention to this because she's preoccupied with her career and selfish and 100 other things? I love that sort of undercurrent. Like, that's why I think, you don't dislike Megan because she's not a satanic doll. She's been programmed to be all that she is fulfilling, and blame her programmers, but she's doing what she's been programmed to do.
And that's where it fell for me. For those exact reasons, it's a double-edged sword. It's what I loved about her in the first 2/3 of this film.
Right.
And then they changed that.
Yeah, a little bit.
With her program, she ends up going, and I think that's what turned me off just a little bit to the ending. Again, overall 3 and Don Shanahan would laugh. I gave it 3 3/4 stubs, not quite 4.
Those 3 minutes, I tell you.
He hates my 3/4, but I do the 3/4 only because it's to relay the idea that it almost got me over, but there was a decision or something that was made that just kept me from really giving it a full 4. And it was they handled her so well and her motivations up until the very end. And I understand that they were going to unplug her, but it is such a drastic thing that she goes to. Like, she goes full, she go at the end, she's full just rogue. I'm going to hurt everybody.
Right.
Villain, even to the point of possibly hurting Katie, even though Katie's hurting her.
Right.
And it was that kind of part at the end where I'm just like, I get it, but at the same time, I'm like, you were doing so well with me, and now you just kind of fell into, well, now she's just on this murderous spree.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is like the last act of this movie, like after the big toy presentation, which goes horribly wrong, and I thought that was I wanted to stay with what happened, the after effects of that lobby when the elevator doors open up and there's 2 dead people right as this rollout's supposed to happen, and Megan just kind of walks out. But she, it all ends up back at Gemma's house, and there's a confrontation, and the robot is not going insane, but it's going after them, and we get into Child's Play territory where the face gets like ripped and burned. You kind of see stuff going on underneath there, and then the face comes off completely. So it's very Terminator. I was like, I liked, for me, the movie, the excitement ended in the lead up to that climax where Gemma and Megan were in the dining room having a very intense like conversation, and Katie comes out of her room, and they're like, don't come in here, we're having an adult conversation or whatever, and there's like this struggle going on. It's a real psychological struggle, and this is where we're talking about the kind of counter messaging where Megan is like talking to Gemma about like, well, you didn't want a family, you were just gonna be like the girl boss, and you're totally into the science, and you don't need anybody, and all that stuff. And it's a critique, and I don't necessarily know that it's a fair one, but it felt like the opening of a conversation that isn't really being had in the culture. Like, what do you sacrifice, when you decide that you don't want necessarily to be a homemaker, and you don't want to have the balance of, having a family and a career necessarily. You just want to be, focused and shut up in your house, tinkering around, being Tony Stark. It's weird because it's like, Tony Stark, we look at, like, he's the billionaire playboy and everything, but when you have like a female version of that, it's kind of like, where's the mothering instinct? I mean, this movie kind of asks that question. It doesn't really go that far into it, but it feels like the opening to something really interesting. So at the end, when it's just like, Okay, Bruce is another example. This giant, rock'em sock'em robot that was supposedly Gemma's, college project. He's introduced in the beginning of the movie. Of course, he's going to come back at the end.
Foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Right.
It's the equivalent of, and they even happen to have F-14s on the tarmac. You're just like,
Right.
but you raise. Oh, good.
Well, I was going to say, like, to me, I think the more interesting version of this, and it still might have gone into the area of cliche, but like when Megan steals the sports car to drive to Gemma's house, it's because it's like a smart car. She can start it. There's no key. It just like start, she interfaces with it. What if Gemma seems like the kind of person who would have like a smart house. Like, what if she'd gone full on like hardware or something and had like turned all the appliances, turned Bruce against Gemma and Katie and had them kind of like have to fight through all these appliances and problems, and like maybe they get locked in a room or something like that because they've got smart locks and everything. It just going the Chucky route for the climax. I understand why they did it, but it just seemed like this movie's an hour and 42 minutes. They spend so much time on it not being a lame horror film that to have it kind of lose steam at the end was a disappointment.
Well, it's funny. Maybe this is another big part of this, but since you guys are horror movie fans, and I dare say aficionados, and I always said when I was the horror movie examiner that the scariest thing about covering horror was how lacking in horror and scares most of the movies were, because a lot of them were very predictable or cheesy, or the audience was asked to relate to dumb characters on screen that you just go, you would not be that stupid. And that's a screenwriter writing you into a corner because he doesn't know how to kill you or how to write a more clever protagonist who would be a worthy opponent for this vicious antagonist. But to your very pointy end, I think the one criticism that I have after seeing this a couple of weeks ago is I wish that Jason Blum, who's I think a very wonderful guy for kind of making horror more accessible and all those kind of things. And this is kind of picking up on your point too, Mark. I wish that Jason Blum had been growing up it was my age, because instead he's growing up on 80s movies, and 80s movies always ended happily. And what this movie needed to end was, I think, a slightly less happy ending. I'll give you a thought on it. I think the little girl should have picked Katie should have picked Megan instead of Gemma. Gemma was a terrible mom up until the very end, and she's even a worse employee for leaving the entire company and all their stockholders and everybody else, leaving in the lurch. And I think Gemma should have paid for it by losing, because Megan, like I said, is right through the entire time. They had to turn her into a crazy, out of brand character, if you will, villain at the end to sort of justify it in a typical 80s way where, well, we have to defeat the bad person. That's just how horror ends. It's like, no, I wanted it ending like the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where it doesn't end with some big shebang. Veronica Cartwright thinks they're okay, and she goes up to Donald Sutherland and he goes, and she's fucked. I mean, I wanted, like, Rosemary's Baby. She doesn't kill the baby. She's like, her mother instinct takes over. Rock him, Rosemary. You're his mother. Yes. The 60s, the 70s. This felt like that, like I said, Westworld, up until that 80s ending. And this needed to be smarter at the end. And I think in many ways, this is kind of like The Ring on steroids, because actually at the end of the day, The Ring is about a bad mom. She's not taking care of her kid. Thank God he's smart, because he's a lot smarter than she is. And she's missing shit, and she gets her ex-husband killed and all this stuff. And she scrapes by the skin of her teeth at the end because she remembers, oh, I have a second tape. But up until then, Naomi Watts is a shit mom. And every chance they get, at every story beat, it's like, she's not a good mom. She's career-oriented. She's clueless. She's not paying attention. Where's Jamie Lee Curtis, who paid attention as Laurie Strode in Halloween and survived at the end? Got the kids to safety, saved herself too. Here, I wanted Gemma to pay for it, and also played by Allison Williams, who is so good at projecting cold charm on screen. You don't like her at all. I never liked her in Girls.
Charm.
She's attractive, but she's unlikable.
She's just like her.
She should pay for it here. She's the worst character on screen. Worse than the little boy who gets his ear pulled off.
Well, there's a weird real world parallel to her father, who is kind of disgraced NBC anchor Brian Williams, who got fired when he made up that story about being, I think, in the helicopter with Hillary Clinton, like under fire, and like none of that ever happened. But he had that kind of like, he's a newsman and he looks perfect and he's got the delivery. I'm Brian Williams. Tonight is the news. It's like perfectly robotic and like Ken-like. But yeah, I can see how. And nothing against Allison Williams. I think you described her perfectly. She fits a type. But yeah.
Well,
I don't know.
the tough part with this happy ending, especially, is even with the 80s ones, at the end, you can pretty much piece together, which is always kind of the fun part, I think, for many horror fans, is what happens next when the credits roll. And a lot of those 80s ones, you're like, well, I could see how this would get explained away and how, yeah, they might get questioned by cops or whatnot, but they leave. There's no clearing of Gemma's name at the end of this.
No accountability.
There's no like they killed Megan and all of a sudden the real evidence gets released into the internet or whatnot, and it's not actually her who have done all these things. They try to play this ending off as a happy ending. Oh, look, Katie chose Gemma over, Megan. Oh, these people aren't killed. Here come the cops to save. I'm like, the cops are going to arrest her. There is absolutely no hint that anybody would suspect anyone but Gemma. And now that you've destroyed the Megan character the robot completely, to where they can't even look at her memory banks or whatever on it because they totally fried her, there is nothing to clear Gemma's name except maybe Katie's. But you could go very easily well, she was through a traumatic event, so how do we know what Katie is saying?
Right. How about the fact that Gemma's responsible for the programming, killing her boss and the assistant, and ruining the stock value of that company and everything else? I mean, even a darker ending right there would have been to have Gemma thinking, oh, I'm a good mom now. It's like, you're still going to get arrested for all your sins because you don't get to wipe away 2 hours of mayhem with one nice gesture.
Well, I'll go you one better because I like this idea of alternate reality endings. Let's assume, because there's sort of this thread that pops up throughout the movie, that Gemma was sort of the second choice to raise Katie because the husband, I think, who had died, or Katie's father, had parents who were in Florida who would be willing to look after Katie, but they couldn't because, it's a low blow, but like, they're from Florida. But if they had taken that, look, it's just the same thing as Southerners saying, "Oh, they're from New York. What do you expect?" It's just stereotypes,
I know.
And yet, some truth in just.
Sure, but
Florida's crazy, all kinds of crazy.
New York's crazy too. Anyway,
true that. But nobody denies New York.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead. So, I didn't mean to distract.
No. But what I'm saying is you take that element out. So if Gemma is Katie's kind of like only chance at being raised by someone in her family, if she did get arrested and Katie was like put in some kind of like a home or an orphanage, wouldn't it have been great if she was put in with equally inattentive parents who, cut to 6 months later, they just happened to bring home the latest toy from the competitive company that because that was the whole thing of having to roll out the new Furby because there was another company that did a knockoff for half the price. What if someone had found out, because there were commercials advertising Megan on television, like this is going to be the big unveiling. What if that company had gotten a hold of that idea and made their knockoff version, and they give one to Katie in this foster home at the end, and it's kind of like, oh, she's screwed. She has to go through this again. It would have been an opening to a sequel, or maybe just like kind of a dark dun dun dun, but it would have been something.
Well, she gets put in a home, and she just happens to take the one item that Gemma had that's technology, which is the now possessed Alexa Dot. Anyway, go ahead.
By the way, I have to offer this to you both, and I'm not trying to audition for Jason Blum or anything, but see, if I was going to do a sequel to this, I would take the bigger idea rather than the character. Now, I know they're not going to do that, and Megan is good enough that I think they can find probably a clever way for her to come back, and God knows they find so many. I mean, how many Chuckies were there? 5 or 6.
Well, they left this open for a sequel, so yeah,
for certainly. But I mean, if I was going to do this, to me, the real theme here, other than who's the better parent, or what do we, are we, and hand in hand with that is we are using technology to basically parent our children. And we have for probably 3 generations now. My generation was the television. Then there's the computer and handheld devices, and now it's TikTok and coming, since they don't have sports and band at school anymore, you can make your own TikToks, and that's your extracurricular activities, and maybe you'll make $1 million too. But to me, the sequel of this is, okay, it's 10 years down the road or 5 years down the road. What has the technology done for some other kind of AI that can be there to supposedly serve man, but maybe is better at doing it than people have become because they're so lazy, they're so codependent. I mean, I think a sequel would be called Kevin, with the E is a 3, and he is like the new account guy in an ad agency or a business, and he's working harder and better and thinking more strategically because he can process all this data, and he's climbing up the success ladder, and maybe that kind of thing. And ultimately, down the road, do you have him become president? I don't know, but I think that's the place that those kind of sequels go, kind of like what they did with Westworld before they started to lose all concept of what is the actual idea here. But I think they have a very smart, snarky, funny idea in that, like, Megan's a better mom than Gemma. That's that's kind of the, if you were looking at what's the movie really about and what is every beat in the Blake Snyder Save the Cat book about, it's like Megan's a better parent than Gemma, because this is Gemma's flaw. She's a terrible mom. She's a selfish woman and a terrible mom. Career driven, I mean, it's sad that she's a woman. It could have been a man, same thing, but nonetheless, she's a bad mom, and Gemma's failing at every turn to Megan. I think the sequel of this could be like, what else does the AI do to make mankind look stupid, and make a comment on us? Then it becomes a blacker comedy, a better satire, and maybe one that adapts to the thing. Sort of like what they tried to do with The Purge, but I don't think it ever worked, because by the third one, they were doing clearly a takeoff on Hillary Clinton, and suddenly it's not what the original intent was. But yeah, you're right. I mean, if they bring back Megan, it's going to be diminished returns on because Megan's got a new family. Boy, are they in for a surprise. That's the tagline already. And it's like, it'll take them 2 reels before anything happens wrong. Can I ask you guys this, though? Because I don't mean to do your hosting thing for you, but you guys know horror really well. And were you surprised at how deftly they did some of the often egregious sins of horror movies? Like, I usually really hate it when they kill an animal in a horror movie because I think it's a cheap, easy death. We don't see the dog killed. The violence is kept to a minimum. I mean, even when the boss is, stabbed, it's not too much. I mean, I love the fact that, they didn't go overboard with some of that stuff. I mean, there was a certain amount of discretion being the better part of valor here, or what did you guys think?
I like that because the dog, we don't see the dog killed, and usually that's a setup for but the body's going to fall out somewhere. But
yes, exactly.
Don't they just make reference to the body being buried?
Yeah,
like,
Megan says he's
like
buried
42 yards.
Yeah, that's right.
Down, kind of a thing.
And we don't see him suffer. We don't see her get her hands on him. He's just pulled away, and that's it. And even his mom, when she's killed, it's not very long of a violent scene. I was surprised that they kind of were reined in on that stuff.
Well, it's nice because the dog, when they like, where's the dog? And she describes where it is. Like, literally, it's very clinical. So you can just, you don't have to see it. You can just imagine, well, she probably bludgeoned it to death, drug it out, buried it, and whatever.
Right.
But she's just describing, oh yeah, if you were to go digging in this spot, you'd see something pretty awful. But yeah, I agree. They do some things right here. I think as far as like a sequel goes, and again, I don't want to see one, but I just think it'd be interesting is the next generation AI or whatever that we have to contend with turns the events of this movie into some kind of a cute meme, like to gloss, because they have to gloss over the fact that this company made a killer doll that they're trying to get in everyone's
that was
home.
So long ago. Yeah.
Right.
It's like January 6th was just tourists.
Well, but but taking an element of it, sensationalizing it to make people think that it either didn't happen or it didn't have as much significance. It's the whole, like, you do the prestige with the hand that people aren't watching.
Right.
But yeah, I would, again, don't want to see a sequel, but I think there is fertile ground for another movie in this vein, perhaps even from this writer. Now, Mark, you saw Malignant last year,
did.
Right?
Yes.
I still haven't seen it. You really liked it, right?
Oh, I loved it. It was crazy. It was not what I expected. They went to a place where I did not think they would go, especially for a film that was talked about so much. It's not as I would say maybe as straight and solidly written as M3GAN. It is a little bit more free in some of its form and its story. But where they went surprised me, because it was something that you don't see anymore, and it's something that I appreciate. And what we're seeing with M3GAN and *Malignant* last year, and even most of the A24 horror, except for Bodies, I really loved. I'm one of apparently the only few that just didn't get Bodies. For me, it was just really a lack. I didn't like anybody, and when we get to the end, I'm like, that was the payoff. But all the other stuff I liked, and what I like to see now moving into mainstream horror is people taking some chances. And while I did say this falls on a lot of tropes in the beginning, it still takes a lot of chances. You can see the influences, but it's definitely trying to do a modern film. And I appreciate horror more that doesn't mind showing its influences, but is trying to not be those films we grew up with. It is trying to be its own, and that's what M3GAN's doing here. This M3GAN is what you would call gateway horror. You got someone who wants to be curious, little reluctant to watch horror films. Don't throw Cannibal Holocaust at them right away, because they're not going to make it, or even Green Inferno, because they're going to get to the third act and went, what's wrong with you?
Yeah, Mark, they won't get past the first act.
They won't get, but you get M3GAN. M3GAN is, as we mentioned, the deaths are implied and off screen. You don't get a whole lot of blood. You still have your creepy horror tropes in here. So if you have someone who's leery about horror, and this is probably why M3GAN has grown in popularity so quickly when it was picked up, is this has got all those horror tropes and spirit without the extra exploitation, excessive elements that also influenced this film. It's a very PG, very PG-13. And so I think that's what the appeal is for this. So this is a gateway horror. And I don't say that as a criticism. I think this is a good movie to start people with, in case they want to get into horror, but you're not sure if they're into blood in that. If they don't mind the death scenes in here, we'll move them into something a little more, maybe Halloween 3. This has a feeling of Halloween 3. You know what I mean?
And to your point, Mark, this is not a dumb horror movie, which, it's like, okay, am I just watching one teenager after another get killed, like so many movies became after the success of the slasher movies of the 80s? This is like, oh, wow, that doll has some character. It is very Twilight Zone. It reminds me of Talkie Tina. It reminds me of Yul Brynner's Gunslinger. It reminds me of HAL 2000. Those are great comparisons. If you have that kind of stuff going, that's a clever script. And I think that's the other thing, is if you're going to introduce people to horror, you have to show them something that has a smart script with characters that you're going to either understand or at least start to sympathize and empathize with, even if they're ostensibly the villain. I think of, like, the Swedish horror movie Let the Right One In, where that little girl is, imagine being a little girl turned into a vampire, and and then the one person who gets you grows up and suddenly is 20 years, 30 years older than you, and he's now your father-esque caretaker, and he's kind of never grown beyond being a 12-year-old. Right off the bat, my heart aches for that vampire, even though I don't like the fact that she's got to feed on people to survive. But it's like, that's a terrible lot. And, this toy was just programmed to do all these things. Thank you, Gemma, that you couldn't do. And now you're going to blame me for that? Before we get to the Teddy and the AI, we have to go through a few M3GANs before we figure out how to make them have a few better judgment calls in the last act.
Right.
This is probably the middle film in that trilogy. You've got M3GAN and then AI. What's the first one? What's
That's
the first
right.
movie in that trilogy? But the reason I brought up *Malignant*, Mark, is because Akilah Cooper, who apparently was the writer of that film, also wrote M3GAN with the story by James Wan.
I can see that. And
that's the thing, is I have not seen a lot of the kind of mainstream horror that's been out in the last couple of years. A lot of things like, oh, I got to catch up on that. What strikes me is, we talked a bit about these waves that kind of came out in the different decades. It was like slashers in the 80s, a slasher renaissance in the 90s, but it was like that self-aware kind of slasher thing. The early 2000s was a lot of, torture porn and J-horror.
Yeah.
What I like about what we've seen in the last couple of years, it is kind of, in my estimation, hard to pin down. A lot of it's coming out from like Blumhouse or kind of like the studios that want to have a Blumhouse wing, but you know, and some of them have like similar like title treatments, you know, like the font for Malignant looks kind of like the font for, you know, I guess Barbarian and then Stranger Things. But you look at you know, Smile, Megan, Malignant, Barbarian, it's not like, oh, this is the that kind of movie. They're all just kind of different weird horror movies, and I think that's you know, it's
Good
kind of
point.
a cool renaissance to be in.
It is for a horror fan. That's why I said I love the fact, and I took a picture last year in the fall that I don't remember a time since literally the 80s where I live in a smaller town. It's a city, but it's the world's biggest small town. Okay. But we have one theater.
Is that De Pere?
No, about an hour, 2 hours west of it, Stevens Point.
Because they used to advertise De Pere as the world's biggest small town.
Yeah. But Point, you know, we've got our downtown's made up of antique shops and that. We're a city of 24,000, but you wouldn't guess it if you drove through us. That's why I love living here. But as a movie fan, it's a little tough because we have one theater that has 7 screens. But where I was going with this, long story short, too late, is I took a picture of the marquee, and I don't think I've seen it since the 80s, to where of the 7 screens we had, 5 had 5 different horror films on them, various levels of horror, but still 5 horror. I'm like, I don't remember in recent 10, 15 years where you saw that many wide released horror films. Usually it's onesie, twosies here or there, but because of the pandemic, one, people kind of rediscovered their love of horror, and 2, horror's cheap. Horror studios love horror, and they're quick to make. They're relatively inexpensive, and as horror fans, and I'll fully admit it, regardless of you go look at it, go, man, that looks like crap, you're going to go to the theater and see it because it's a horror film on the big screen. You're going to go see it, and they get their money regardless.
And you get the experience of screaming with people, because I think that's one of the things that makes going to the theater better. You can watch horror at home and you'll be afraid to go to bed at night. You're wondering what's under the bed or in the closet, but you watch it with people and you scream, but it's a funny scream and everybody laughs afterwards because it feels good. That's actually a very good point too. And I'll just say this quickly, Ian. You know, I criticized Jason Blum earlier, but one of the things I do like about him is his whole modus operandi is he'll do a movie for $10 million and it'll make that easily its first weekend. And then after that, everything is gravy. One of the things that I thought was also a very shrewd move, whether it was by him or Gerard Johnstone, the director, but
whose name sounds like a Flintstones character.
It does, doesn't it? Barney, let's get that Gerard Johnstone to direct this. Hey, yeah, Fred, he knows how to do cheap horror really good. But what I loved about the approach of this is most of the effect of Megan is that little girl who was a dancer, and you know, I think she had some ballet training which made her move really good, but it's her in this costume, and they don't try to make it too CGI. And you know, if this was all CGI and she moved really well, we'd know that it was CGI, and somehow it would not be as effective. We're having a little girl, even though it looks a little bit fake, you know, she's got the mask on and maybe moves a little too well. It works because she's really in the scene. And I think that makes a difference here. And then somehow it also, I dare say, plays up what you can't necessarily get across here, is that, you know, she is supposed to be so lifelike and real that you maybe would not question whether she was just a doll, that she's more. And the actress's name was Amy Donald, who did that. And in fact, you've seen her on some of the TikToks, and she does the dance where she's become already sort of iconic. I mean, I think we should have a dance off between Wednesday Addams and
I had that thought the other day. I had that thought today.
Somebody on TikTok, come on, there's your next your next assignment, right? But I mean, I love the fact that Jason Blum said, no, let's go with the real little girl dressed as this. We'll save a ton of money and it'll look better and it'll place the character in the scene. So it just plays all the more real, which I think really helped.
Well, horror fans in general, I will say right now, you want to win a horror fan over, at least win half the battle, keep it practical. You will win over 99% of your horror fan base who love horror if you keep the majority of your effects practical, or if you do use CGI, make it so that you're not quite noticing it.
Yeah.
you're going to win it over, because one of the main themes running throughout horror communities, regardless of which community you look at, is if it's practical, you have some respect already for that. Even, you know, and in here they're playing with M3GAN, they're playing to the uncanny valley. It's what Robert Zemeckis unintentionally did with Polar Express. They're intentionally doing it here with, they make M3GAN almost too lifelike, to where that uncanny valley is supposed to, and they use that as the element of the horror, which is much more effective than trying to do a kids movie about Santa Claus. So.
and look, I just gotta say, Mark, I agree with you. However, the Polar Express by Robert Zemeckis has become a Christmas staple in our house the last couple of years.
Well,
the more I watch it, the less I have a problem with the because I was right there with you when it first came out in what, 04. I was like, I saw it in IMAX at Navy Pier, like, talk about a horror movie. Oh my God.
What was the movie before that? Was it the one where the
Beowulf?
Yeah,
Beowulf,
but even before that, was it Final Fantasy or one of those? It was based on a game.
Yeah, it was Final Fantasy.
And the girl's hair had more personality than her entire face did through the entire movie. It's like, wow, they got every hair in her head to move, but her eyes never do. It's just
which is, you know, that's half the people I see on reality TV nowadays. But all right, well, we're gonna wrap this up, guys. I do want to, before we get to our final thoughts, I want to pull over, because I ran a contest the other day for the movie The Bad Guys, which I watched and I loved, and I said, whoever wants to follow me on Twitter and send me their favorite heist film, I would pick a random winner. And out of the dozens, and by dozens I mean one entry I got for this, Leslie B said that her favorite heist movie is Ocean's 11. So Leslie, you will be receiving this very copy of The Bad Guys on Blu-ray in the mail very soon.
I was going to enter in that, but the last time I did that, I got a signature, a signed mini poster from the star of Hercules. So, you know,
you know what,
Hercules movie. So
Steve Reeves.
What that was years ago, right?
The other Hercules.
That was a 60s Hercules.
Arnold Schwarzenegger? No. But all right, yeah. So I just wanted to do that here live in case you end up watching this. But all right, so yeah, final thoughts on M3GAN. Mark.
Oh, sure. Okay, I go first. As I mentioned, it's not a bad horror film at all. I can see why mainstream audiences have attached themselves to M3GAN, because this is exactly why they made this. This is a horror film for those audiences specifically, but also has enough familiarity for your devoted, really engrossed horror fan to possibly at least enjoy the watch. They're probably not going to visit it again, but at the same time, they may feel like they didn't waste their time, like a horror film of the same time last year, The Grudge remake, which was painful in every aspect of that film. And coming from me, that's a bold statement, but because I usually try to find the best in films, but I will say, M3GAN overall, there's appeal there. Even a mediocre, if people think it's mediocre who are really into horror, but it's worth seeing on the screen with an audience. It's worth, if you're curious about horror, you could take your teenager to it. You could feel no problems with taking a teenager to it to have any uncomfortable moments like in the 80s. And overall, M3GAN shows you that horror is here to stay for a while, which for me, I'm very happy to see. It also shows you that filmmakers are taking some chances. Now, it's a pretty safe film overall, but they're taking chances in that they're trying to make a more modern horror film, because we've got so many horror filmmakers trying to make an exact film like what they grew up with.
or literally doing reboots and remakes,
or literally hanging on to that IP because it's a recognizable name and they know there's an established fan base. There's opening weekend tickets right there. If you do a Child's Play movie, doesn't matter if it looks like crap, you've got opening weekend tickets right there, which is what it's all about. But I like to see them doing more modern horror. I like to see this emergence of horror being embraced by people, even if it's the wide release kind and not maybe the indie stuff that I like more. And overall, yeah, I mean, Megan's, it's a good time at the theater. I had fun with it outside of the problems I had with it, and yeah, it's definitely watchable and far better than where we started last year. So,
all right, Jeff.
Well, I will return to what you originally said, and that is it something that necessarily is an instant classic or becomes a cult classic, whatever else. I think it is one of those that is instantly likable, fun, and smart than most of the horror fare out there. I think it's very accessible to all the points that Mark made, and you made as well, Ian. I will say this. I think if this film is evaluated in future years and maybe, year-end lists in a year or so, or less than a year now, I think will be for what else it had to say in a Twilight Zone kind of way. I mean, I think the Twilight Zone was all about, sort of the status quo and the falsehood of the American dream narrative and sort of what, sort of America's post World War II colonialism tended to be and the dangers of science and overachieving with modern technology, et cetera, et cetera. I think this will be reevaluated with that kind of lens, because I think if you take away it's a killer doll and it's a horror movie and it's this and that, it's about bad parenting. It's about using technology to babysit. It's about how far do we want to give this respect and personality and power, which we do all the time. And I think because of that, as this becomes more and more of an issue in our days, that may beg for some reevaluation, because I think it's a very pointed satire. And the read between the lines is a lot smarter even than this film is on face value, which is a pretty clever horror movie.
I agree. I do think it would have been nice to be able to explore some of the bigger ideas. I mean, I'm thinking even TV series kind of stuff, because something that stuck out, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole because we're wrapping up, but they were talking about the cost of this doll and how they're trying to get the price point down to just under $10,000. I'm like, this is supposed to be a mass market product, right? Something like you can buy as on a Furby budget, but the implication is that everyone's going to want one. So does that mean people are going to go into debt to get this thing that's going to, destroy their family? Are they that desperate to not have to connect with their kids or to keep up with the Joneses or to get the new iPad? I mean, this is the iPhone on steroids, right?
There's the sequel, Ian. M3GAN, the layaway plan.
Yeah.
There you go. Layaway plan sounds like a Gerard Butler movie or something. But anyway, so I do also want to end with David Fowley, who couldn't be with us tonight. He had some thoughts on it. He said it's a great way to kick off the movie year. Just kind of surprising that it happened the first week of 2023. And he said, this is a quote that I don't know if he originated it, but it definitely deserves to be on a Blu-ray slipcase. M3GAN is AI-conic.
Oh, nice.
AI-conic.
Very nice. Very
Love
nice.
That's nice. Yeah. I would just, I know you're wrapping up, but I'll just say this. Another reason I think why this is effective, and why more effective than now, is because our culture and our entire civilization of sorts has caught up to sci-fi. Whereas in 80s and even early 90s, if you had the rogue AI, you'd look at it and go, I mean, this is fun and kind of scary, but
it's fiction. It can't ever happen.
It's we would never. But you have M3GAN coming out, and up to it, you have at least 10 years of news reports and reports, descriptions of how realistic some robots are created that are made now that ask and respond and show emotion. Or you get those reports of, we let these two AIs talk to each other. In about 5 minutes, they developed their own language, started to talk to each other. When we translated it, they didn't like humans very much, so we had to shut it down.
Right.
You know what I mean? Right. But I mean, you're getting, the technology is catching up to the scary sci-fi technology. And that's what I think also makes a film like M3GAN more effective, is because you're like, well, yeah, I actually read in last week that there was a robot that does exactly what M3GAN does.
Well, it's Ava in Ex Machina. I mean, what's her one sin? She's been programmed to think and act like a human. What's
Right.
the biggest thing about human instinct? The will to survive.
Yeah.
So she does what she needs to survive. Same here. Megan's supposed to protect that kid and parent her. And if that means getting rid of the worst parent, the worst of the two assigned parents, that's her directive.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many different ideas here, but yeah, it all kind of comes down to the fallibility of the people who are, programming this stuff.
Right.
I mean, one of the things that drives me crazy is, people talk about like these Alexa devices and whatever, where you say its name and that it, will answer any question. They're like, well, it's not invasive. I mean, it's not listening to me all the time.
Yeah,
Like,
it is.
yes, it is, because how else would it know when you say its name?
No, it is, because I'll have a conversation with my wife in the kitchen, and all of a sudden Alexa will just answer something, and we just both look at it going, "Oh,
No, that's when you bring out the
okay."
hammer, Mark. Get that shit out of your
Or Mark,
house.
Mark, next time you're talking to a friend or whomever about some topic that you're interested in, or maybe it's about like an Italian restaurant, or some rash or something you have. Watch your internet feed. Next time comes up.
Oh yeah.
Oh, suddenly there's a rash ad there, or suddenly there's an Olive Garden. What's that about? It's like somehow they're taking that. Like, I think Mark is obsessed with Italian food. Let's remind him of how he really wants that right now.
One search in Google, and suddenly your Facebook feed will be filled with ads.
Exactly.
Well, I just want to say for the record, I love all of this AI technology, especially Alexa, because I want this stream to end without like breaking. Anyway. I can't allow you to continue, Ian. All right, guys, thank you so much for hanging out and talking about M3GAN. I enjoyed this movie. I think I had about as much fun exploring the ideas and what it was not with you guys than I did, watching it. I don't know if I'll ever watch it again, but I'm not unhappy that I caught it in a theater. So, yeah, thank you. I'm as always, Ian Simmons. I have Jeff York from The Establishing Shot, Mark the Movie Man Krawczyk from The Spoiler Room and Special Mark Productions. Guys, thank you very much. We will talk again soon about something or other. But until then, whenever that is, whatever that is, thanks. Take care. Oh, by the way, everyone, check out my friends and colleagues' sites and work, all linked down below. And please like and subscribe and all that good, YouTube social business. So yeah, next time, whenever that is, whatever that is, thanks. Take care and good night. And beware, Siri.